Well, Gilmour's created Trenton. I mean, there isn't even a question about that. It just did. Trenton wouldn't be Trenton if Balin Gilmour had not come there. It would be another place altogether.
He was self-possessed. He was determined and a little arrogant. I think more than a little arrogant.
The day David Gilmour moved to Trenton, he was already brash, hard-headed, ambitious, and self-confident beyond the point of arrogance. At 29, David was used to having things his own way. The first chance he had, he moved into a 12-room Italianate-styled brick home on the top of a hill, overlooking both the town and the whole Bay of Quinte. Prospect House. The town took note. It wasn't long before everyone knew. Trenton was never going to be the same again.
The Gilmours were part of a little cabal in Montreal. The Red Pass, the Gilmours, Lord Strathcona, they're all Scots. They had a Scottish thing there. I think David Gilmour was involved in that, and his uncle was the president of it for a while. It's Alan of Shotts.
David had come to Trenton to take over operation of the Gilmour and Company sawmill there. You might say he was born for the job. On the day of his birth in London, England, in January 1851, his father's cousin Alan was in Trenton, then Trent Port, laying plans for a new mill on the mouth of the Trent River. The Gilmours were a lumber family, first in Scotland and then in Canada.
The Gilmours were actually merchants as much as they were lumber people, and that was sort of their peak period. And the store on Dundas Street was actually a store for Gilmour goods, and they were bringing them in by the shipload from Great Britain, from England, British-made goods, and selling them in all through Canada, mostly along the St. Lawrence and Lake Ontario in the beginning, and then they got into the upper Great Lakes after that.
With a 12,400 square kilometer watershed extending north far beyond the Kawartha Lakes to the fringes of the Algonquin Highlands and feeding south into the Bay of Quinte, the Trent was already a great source of pine logs to feed the Gilmour mills at Ottawa and Quebec City. Building a new mill at the mouth of the Trent made good business sense. While David was growing up, the mill at Trent Port thrived. By 1872, Gilmour and Company employed about 160 men and 30 boys. The workers and their families made up about a third of Trenton's population and accounted for about a third of Trenton's municipal tax base. In 1873, about 168,000 pine logs made their way down the Trent to the Gilmour Mill. While the mill in Trenton was becoming a growing concern, David, along with his brothers and cousins, was learning the ropes of the lumber business at the Gilmour Mill in Quebec City.
Gilmour Company had an immense impact on Trenton. Trenton would not exist as it does today without the Gilmour Company. It created Trenton. If they had never come to Trenton, Trenton would still be Trent Port, and it would be mostly on the west side of the river, and the east side would be Anwood. And it was Gilmour's that made that come together.
He must have learned them well. When a spate of deaths and retirements forced the Gilmours to reorganize their Canadian operations and management in 1879, David was dispatched to Trenton to manage the operation there. At the same time, the company shut down its operations in Quebec in order to focus on its businesses in Ottawa and to a lesser degree in Trenton. But David was not about to settle for a lesser degree. Ensconced at the top of Prospect Hill in Gilmour House, David set about on an ambitious program for expansion. At first, it looked as if politics might stand in his way. But as it turned out, politics was one of the ropes of the lumber business that David had learned best. In the fall of 1878, The outgoing federal Liberal government of Alexander Mackenzie had decided that the existing locks on the dams on the Trent were a financial burden, and it would be best to turn them over to the provincial government. The Ontario government, facing an election, saw the opportunity for votes in the Trent Valley by promising to remove the dams and sell the previously flooded area for farmland. This would be a disaster for the lumber businesses, including the Gilmours. While the Trent had many navigable stretches, it was frequently broken by falls and rapids. In the 254 kilometers between Balsam Lake and the Bay of Quinte, the Trent plunges 181 meters. Before the dams and locks were built, jams, delays, and damage to the timber made lumbering nearly impossible. Gilmour and others lobbied the incoming Conservative Prime Minister John A. Macdonald to overturn the transfer. Speaking before a select committee of the House of Commons, Gilmour said,
"When the water is low, the logs get strewn along the shores, and it is only by flooding that we can get them off. We have to use Chisholm's Dam as a flooding dam to get over 9 Mile Rapids below. If Chisholm's Dam were taken away, we might as well stop operations, as it is now with difficulty that we can make the business support itself."
To a modest person, dreaming big is taking them out of their comfort zone a long way. In the Gilmour world, they just did it. It wasn't even dreaming. They just conceived it and did it. I don't think it was they just were so sure of themselves they could do anything, and they pretty much did. I mean, it's an amazing company. The quality of everything they did was at top notch. Everything they built was as good as it could be at the time.
The lumbermen won the battle. Macdonald's government reversed the transfer. The dams and canals were saved. Looking back, it's hard to believe that Gilmour was in fact having any real difficulty making the business support itself. He immediately set off on a spending spree to expand and improve on the mill. While David had been learning the ropes at the feet of the older generation in Quebec City, he had all the time been thinking that there had to be a better way of doing things. To David, that meant producing more lumber more cheaply. It meant mechanizing the sawmill. David had kept his eye on the latest innovations in lumbering technology, and he was no slouch at innovating himself. During the winter of 1879-1880, under the direction of foreman and head millwright Robert Hall, extensive renovations were made to the Trenton mill to reduce the amount of manual labor required to handle the lumber. New gang saws with thinner blades were installed, reducing vibration and greatly reducing the amount of sawdust waste. New keystone blowers were brought in to blow sawdust away from the blades with bursts of air. Geared rollers carried the lumber throughout the mill. A team of 7 men could assort, cull, and load the lumber without moving a yard from where they stood all day. A lathe machine was installed, allowing the company to turn a profit from inferior wood that would otherwise have gone to waste. Outside, nearly a kilometer of elevated railway track was constructed so that the lumber could now be piled directly onto one of the 3 shipping wharves jutting into the bay. A gas plant was built on site, and gas lighting was installed to allow the mill to operate into the night. To enhance fire protection, a 23-meter brick tower was built to hold a water tank, feeding 4 hydrants in the mill yard. Gilmour vowed not to cut the workforce. He would use the advances to increase the mill's output. In 1880, an incredible 268,043 logs were fed into the saws at Trenton Mill. And David kept expanding. A new auxiliary mill was built to saw large cedar logs and squared timber. The main mill was lengthened. New double circular slabber saws were installed. 2 new boilers were added. In the Bay of Quinte, more wharves were built on reclaimed land. To top things off, Gilmour ordered Trenton's first 2 telephones. They connected the mill office directly with the business office on Dundas Street, but to no one else. In May of 1881, Gilmour and Company expanded again. A new shingle mill opened, employing an additional 30 men and boys. To accommodate a growing workforce, the company built new homes. Cutting operations in the northern timber limits were expanding as well to keep up with the growth in Trenton. Over the winter of 1880-1881, Gilmour had 390 of his own men and another 200 employed by jobbers under contract to him. The company expected to bring 150,000 logs down the Moira and another 250,000 logs down the Trent. Weather conditions looked favorable for a good run. From the top of the hill, David Gilmour could look out over the town and be pleased. At 6 in the morning on the 18th of May, 1881, fire was discovered at the mill. Despite valiant attempts by Gilmour employees and the town's fire brigade, most of the main mill, as well as the adjoining boiler and engine rooms, were destroyed. Recent rains and light winds helped to save the immense piles of sawn lumber in the mill yards, but more than 300 men were thrown out of work in one day. David went straight to Ottawa to confirm with other partners. Back in Trenton, rumors flew that the operation might move to Belleville or be sold to the rival Rathburn Company in Deseronto. Difficulties arose settling the insurance claims. The mill had been insured with 10 different companies for a total of $75,000. The damage was estimated at twice that. In the end, only $48,000 was recovered. David was left facing an expensive and lengthy legal battle if he was going to fight for the rest. But David had another idea for his time and his money. It was called the Big Mill. The Big Mill at Trenton. Everywhere lumber was talked about, they talked about the Big Mill at Trenton. David's idea was not just to rebuild, but to build the biggest, most modern, best equipped facility anywhere in the world. It was over 52 meters long and 24 meters wide, with smaller wings to house a lathe mill and for sorting finished lumber. The frame was built from heavy timbers, the roof made from heavy sheet iron imported from Scotland. The new boiler and engine houses were constructed on a foundation of huge stone blocks. 3 feet of rock were excavated and large iron bands were laid down with 12 feet of stonework laid over that, so that when the huge gang saw was screwed into the iron bands, it wasn't about to shake. A dynamo magnetic machine was purchased from the Brush Electric Company of Cleveland, driven by a 24 horsepower steam engine. It supplied current for 6 carbon arc lamps. It was one of the first electric installations in Canada. With new laws in Ontario preventing dumping of sawdust into the bay, a new 38-meter high bottled-shaped furnace was built, biblically named Gehenna. The Big Mill cost more than $250,000. The first Trenton mill could handle 425 logs a day. The Big Mill could convert 3,000 logs into 400,000 feet of lumber, 1 million lathe, and 100,000 shingles, pickets, and headings, all in one 10-hour shift. It was powered by 16 100-horsepower boilers feeding twin steam engines of 1,500 horsepower each. The Trenton Courier described the mill as
a perfect wilderness of wheels, pulleys, and belts in rapid motion. There's no carrying of lumber or slabs from place to place by hand, as all transfers are made by means of live rollers and moving chains. In fact, the machine is made to do away almost entirely with manual labor.
Despite the mechanization, it would take 500 men and 100 boys to operate the mill at full capacity. Out in the mill yards, 2 steam locomotives and 100 railway cars, augmented by several horse-drawn cars, transported lumber along 8 kilometers of tracks to the piling grounds and wharves. More tracks extended northward from the mill to the Grand Trunk Railway on the edge of town. Additional piling grounds were located adjacent to the extension, requiring another 2 locomotives. When a resident adjacent to the new tracks objected, Gilmour simply bought her house.
One interesting thing is everybody thinks they went bankrupt, but they didn't go bankrupt. Bankrupt means you don't have any money left or any value left, but they didn't go bankrupt. They went into receivership the very early 1900s, and they were still selling off Gilmour properties up into the 1930s. They had, in terms of the time, they had about $15 million in local assets in Trenton. They owned an immense amount of Trenton. Well, a lot of houses, yeah, and a lot of empty lots that were approved for construction but hadn't been built on yet. And not only there, they owned the logging rights all over the place, and just outright purchased properties with logs on them, not even logging rights. I was astounded by the amount of assets that they had at the end. It was amazing.
On the 3rd of May, 1882, just less than a year after the fire, the big mill at Trenton sawed its first log. Although Gilmour and Company had dominated the Trenton economy since 1852, David Gilmour was the first company director to make Trenton his home. During the 26 years he lived in Trenton, he served as president of the curling club and the rowing club. He was honorary president of both the cricket and toboggan clubs. He donated land for new curling and skating rinks to be built, and he contributed money to help construct a new boathouse for the rowing club. Under his patronage, the Gilmour Fire Brigade Band was formed and went on to great acclaim locally and throughout the region. In 1881, he was elected reeve, a position he held for only a few months before his opponent in the election successfully lobbied the province to overturn the result over a conflict of interest on Gilmour's part. Gilmour rid himself of the conflict and ran again, trouncing his opponent largely on the strength of votes from workers in his mill. He served as reeve for a 1-year term, during which he learned that the potential for conflicts made it difficult to use the influence of the office to his own advantage. He didn't run for a second term.
He was incredibly generous. He donated to everything. He supported everything. He supported kids' sports in Trenton. I mean, he was a super Trentonian. I don't know how you could say a bad word against him. I don't think he ever did anything wrong. He just tried to do things that ordinary people couldn't do. And for the most part, he did it.
The major issue throughout his term in office had been unresolved: water power in Trenton. Tumbling by a steep series of rapids into the town, the Trent River possessed considerable potential for generating power, which could foster industrial development if it could be harnessed. Gilmour had proposed that the town give him financial assistance to build a combined bridge and dam on his property. In return, the town would receive a portion of the power generated to sell to other interested parties. Gilmour also promised to create new jobs for the town by building a sash and door factory at the dam. After years of lengthy and often nasty negotiation and fierce debate, the issue was eventually resolved. In exchange for his land, Gilmour would get all of the power generated on the east side of the river and 1/2 of all the power generated on the west. In addition, the town would pay him $23,000 to build the dam. With 250 men toiling on the project, it was completed in December of 1885. It spanned the river just downstream from the Grand Trunk Railway Bridge. The Trenton Courier commented,
"We were not aware of the fact until recently, but we have been informed on good authority that every time the water jumps over the dam, it shouts, "Gilmour! Gilmour! Gilmour!"
Gilmour's long-promised sash and door factory at the dam was eventually completed in 1888. Drawing from a flume on the east side of the river, the plant was powered by 6 turbines. Turning out blinds, moldings, casings, siding, and flooring along with window sashes and doors, the factory, unlike the mill, operated year-round. It quickly became an important part of the Trenton economy. And heading into a new decade, the Trenton economy looked bright.
David Gilmour was literally a genius. I have no question about that. And it's not the fact that he made water run uphill. I give it his genius qualifications for the fact that he created the slab door, which is the door that was used throughout the world for 70 years. And it was invented in Trenton by David Gilmour. And he had patents all over the world on that door. And it was the most effect of that anybody in Trenton ever had on the world was that one door. He created it to use mill waste, which was pretty unusual. And that was the center of the door. And then he put thin veneers on the outside of the door. And I don't think he understood exactly what it was doing, but it dramatically changed the way doors were manufactured all through the world. And he did it just at the beginning of the Art Deco period. So all of a sudden, instead of this door with panels and rails, and there was a door that was just a door, just a piece of very solid wood. And it appeared all over the place. He sold to all high-end hotels in Europe. For instance, to this day you can go to Paris and go in a hotel room, and that door that you're going through was a Gilmour door. And he had patents in several countries in the world. And in Trenton, that's almost an unknown thing. But I believe that's the biggest thing.
In November of 1889, there wasn't a soul in Trenton who wasn't shocked to learn that the big mill wouldn't be starting back up in the spring as usual. The mill and every other asset of Gilmour and Company had suddenly been put up for sale. It didn't seem to make any sense. Just the year before, 216,937 logs had come down the Trent, and almost as many had come down the Moira. The saws had sliced 78 million feet of lumber. What could possibly have gone wrong? As it turned out, Gilmour and Company was $700,000 in debt between its Trenton and Ottawa area operations. David was a big part of the problem. Not everyone was surprised. Some industry insiders had begun to question the wisdom of building the big mill. Writing in the October 1888 edition of Canadian Lumberman, one observer claimed,
"The Trenton mill boasted probably the largest cutting capacity of any mill in the world, but it had never once run to its fullest capacity because it would have required nearly all the logs harvested on the Trent River to have furnished food for its capacious jaws."
Surely David must at some point have realized that a large, highly mechanized mill needed to run at full capacity to benefit from the economies of scale he had planned for. If he was going to run one of the world's biggest mills at full capacity, surely he must have realized he was going to need enough raw material to keep it running. In fact, by the late 1880s, David was painfully aware that the mill was vastly out of proportion to the company's timber limits that had already been logged for 25 and in some cases 50 years. The most economically harvested pine was gone, and what was left was being rapidly depleted in a desperate attempt to feed the insatiable big mill. An auction sale was scheduled for April 9, 1890 in Ottawa, but that was cancelled. Another auction was scheduled for July 31, but that one was cancelled as well. In September, the partners announced that the company was to be split into two separate firms. John Gilmour and his cousin, John David Gilmour, had formed John Gilmour and Company and took over control of the Chelsea Fall Mill and timber limits near Ottawa. Brothers Allen and David Gilmour would control the operation in Trenton under the Gilmour and Company name. None of that meant that the Trenton operation was no longer for sale. In fact, arch rival Edward Rathbun forked over $10,000 for an option to purchase the company assets there. But Rathbun was more interested in the timber limits than he was in the mill. Rathbun traveled to England, where a syndicate was prepared to pay $4 million to purchase the Deseronto Mill and limits. With Gilmour assets included in the deal, Rathbun wanted $6 million. Before a deal could be struck, a downturn hit the British securities market, and the whole thing fell apart. Undaunted, Rathbun proceeded with plans to purchase Gilmour and Company on his own. In January 1891, it was widely reported that a deal was close. Rathbun was ready to pay $850,000 for the Trenton Mill and timber limits. But when reports came back that both the quality and quantity of standing pine in the Gilmour limits had been exaggerated, Rathbun wanted the price reduced. Gilmour held his ground. The deal was dead. David found himself with a big, hungry mill without enough pine to feed it. The Ontario government had for many years been considering what to do with a vast tract of virgin forest straddling the Height of Land region, dividing the Ottawa Valley from the region drained by Georgian Bay. This rugged lake and hill country occupied the western rim of the Algonquin Highlands, to the north of the Trent River watershed. These forests carpeted the headwaters of the westward flowing Oxtongue, Big East, Magnetowan, and South Rivers. A plan was in place to open the rugged Algonquin Highlands to pioneer farmers. But James Dixon and other surveyors had found that the land offered only meager possibilities for agriculture. Another proposal then surfaced that the land might be offered up as a park instead. A national park that would protect the headwaters of the many streams drained from the highlands, and as a means of preserving fish and game stocks. As this proposal did not exclude lumbering, most lumber companies threw themselves behind the idea of creating a national park. In March 1892, the Ontario government established a Royal Commission on Forest Reservation and National Park. Soon after, it announced the Algonquin Highland Forest would be included in an auction of new timber berths to be put to auction later that year. It was to be the first auction of new timber berths in 5 years. The 1887 auction had seen prices skyrocket over previous years, and it was expected that they might go higher still. Dozens of lumber companies from Canada and the United States sent representatives, many eager, some, like Gilmour, desperate for new timber. David represented the company himself. He had his eye on 7 of the berths. One, an area of largely virgin pine in the Canoe and Joe Lake region in northern Peck Township, had been assessed by one surveyor as being worth no more than $1,200 a square kilometer. The auctioneer was Peter Ryan, said to be one of the best. The berths went on the block one by one. At the end of the day, the rights to cut pine on 1,650 square kilometers of timberland had been sold for a whopping $2,308,475. David walked away with 7 berths of what he believed to be choice pine timber limits in Peck, Hunter, and McLaughlin in the Oxtongue River headwaters. These were the berths he wanted. These were the berths he needed. Everyone at the auction knew that, and knowing that, bidders kept driving up the prices against him.
They were all desperate for material at that point in time. They were starting to get desperate for big logs, like the big material that they've been living on for for how long, all the way up through the Ottawa Valley and everything else was all that big stuff, and they really didn't have themselves set up for hardwood and that side of thing. They were only interested in pine, so that it made the bait, shall I say, a lot more attractive than maybe than time would prove profitable. They doing anything else but big lumber, big material, and I think they were all desperate for it. And I said before, there was definitely a Muskoka group, shall I say, or a Georgian Bay, that whole side, having the same problem. They were starting to run out of material too, but they were sort of scratching each other's backs a bit, I think, when it came to the bidding process, and I think they deliberately bid Gilmour up on that one, and wound up hurting them.
The average price for the rest of the berths sold that day was about $1,100 per square kilometer. For the Peck Township berth, David ended up paying $6,757 per square kilometer. Altogether, he spent about $750,000 that day for the right to log just 225 square kilometers of forest. The day must have taken its toll. A few weeks after, he left with his family on an extended vacation in Europe. The reason given was that he needed to recover his health.
He was self-possessed. He was determined and a little arrogant. I think more than a little arrogant, but he must have been for several reasons. One is that he got himself suckered into overspending on the material, which didn't, by the way, turn out to be as good a lumber as he thought he was going to get, and it was good logs. There was a lot of rot in them when he got them, and he didn't know it, so maybe he didn't have the timber cruising done that should have been done too.
David knew that purchasing the Algonquin timber was the easy part. If spending $750,000 could be considered easy. As most observers saw it, there was no practical way for David to get the Algonquin timber to the mill in Trenton. That was going to be the hard part. The Oxtongue River is a part of the Muskoka River system, flowing westward to Georgian Bay. High ranges of hills separated the Muskoka watershed from that of the southward flowing Trent. It seemed like an impossible task. But David Gilmour hadn't spent $750,000 on pine limits without a plan for how he was going to get the pine to his mill. He was going to use the waterways. He had conceived an ambitious scheme to conduct a 445-kilometer log drive utilizing 3 different river systems and an ingenious mechanism to carry the logs over the hills between them. He was going to float the logs uphill. It seems years earlier, David had watched with curiosity and even grudging respect as one of his fellow Trent River lumbermen, Mossam Boyd of Bobcaygeon, had tried to solve almost the same problem, although on a much smaller scale. Mossam and his son, Mossam Martin Boyd, had timber limits in Haliburton, and although most lay within the Trent watershed, a northern section extended into the Hollow Lake district, east of Dorset. Hollow Lake drains westward down the Hollow River to the Lake of Bays, part of the Muskoka River system. In the early 1880s, the Boyds harvested almost 8 million feet of timber near Hollow Lake on the strength of a simple but clever plan to get it south through the hills to nearby St. Nora Lake in the Gull watershed. They proposed to dam the outlet to Hollow Lake, raising the water about 2 meters so that it would spill over a low spot at the southwest end of the lake and down a short valley to nearby Raven Lake. Gravity would power the whole scheme. A few modest dams and easily excavated canals would affect the diversion of water and allow for a drive of up to 20,000 logs a day.
First idea was to come out of Hollow Lake. There's a blind dam at the end of Hollow Lake, and Mossam Boyd had tried to do that, and he got shot down, and he wanted to open that dam up, and that would have given them lots of water out of Hollow Lake because it's a big lake. But he got shut down by, they had a powerful lobby of logging companies in Muskoka. Gravenhurst, Huntsville, Bracebridge, carried a lot of weight politically too.
When the Boyds went to the province for approval of the project, lumber companies that drove logs on the Muskoka River objected, arguing that the Muskoka would be adversely affected if the project was allowed to go ahead. The Boyds argued that the Hollow Lake Dam would only trap some of the excess spring runoff that would otherwise have just escaped into Georgian Bay at a season when the Muskoka River was already swollen. The government sided with the rival lumbermen, and the project was quashed. At least until David came along and realized it would solve a large part of his problem. All that was left was to figure out a way to get the logs from the Lake of Bays to Raven. At its natural level, Raven Lake stood some 33 meters higher, and although a mere 2.5 kilometers away, it is separated from Lake of Bays by a range of hills as much as 100 meters above water level.
There, Raven Lake is much higher altitude than the Lake of Bays. It was actually 90 feet difference. And they trying to figure out how they were going to get these logs out of the Lake of Bays and up into the Raven Lake and into that system. And their imagination to see how they could do it. But they found a little stream that ran out of Raven Lake and out of, it was actually a swampy, boggy area, but the water ran out and it tumbled down over that hill into Paint Lake, which is just south of here. But it's only a small stream. But what they saw it was the ability to dam. It was a long, hollow gully, and what they saw was if you dammed that off, you could shut everything else off that was running out toward the Muskoka River or in the Black Lake and the Black River. If they could dam all those off, they could build up a big pond, and then that would give them access to Raven Lake or to the Trent system, because the Raven Lake is the top end of the Trent system.
Fortunately for David, an ancient narrow fault cuts northwest of Raven on the Lake of Bays side. It was a circuitous path, almost 5 kilometers long, but it ran almost level with Raven Lake for at least 3 of those. David effectively turned this whole section into a sort of canal by building a large timber dam at the outlet of Raven Lake, raising the lake level enough to have it flood back along the pass to descend it into the Lake of Bays side. He built another dam to contain the water at that end. Constructed of earth and stone, it was 7 meters high and 60 meters long. It was to become known as the Tramway Dam. The section of the canal behind it became known as Tramway Pond. This was because David's ingenious scheme to overcome the 35-meter rise over the remaining 1.8 kilometers of this planned epic log drive was to become known as the Tramway.
He was able to shut the water off and build his pond. He built a lake, really. We call it Gilmour's Pond, but it was about 25 to 28 feet deep. And you can, even to this day, if you know where to look, you can see where the water lines were there. Anyway, so then the next step is, how do I get my logs from that 90 feet up here? And so that was when he built the tramway itself, which it was quite an ingenious thing.
Technically, it wasn't a tramway at all. While truly a remarkable piece of engineering, it was really just the marriage of two simple technologies built to a massive scale. It consisted of a jack ladder on the Lake of Bays side to lift the logs up a modest initial slope, a slide to convey them across a level stretch of country to the north of the pass at the base of the inland hills, and another, much longer jack ladder to carry them up the pass to the top of the Tramway Dam. The first jack ladder started off on the south shore of Lake of Bays, 2 kilometers west of Dorset, 60 meters long and rising 12 meters above the water level. It consisted of a wooden dam with an endless chain. Cleats on the chain gripped the logs and conveyed them up the incline. To power it, Gilmour constructed a stone powerhouse containing a huge boiler and 2 450 horsepower steam engines. Through a series of shafts, ropes, and pulleys, these also drove a set of powerful centrifugal pumps that could lift 20,000 gallons of water a minute to a large wooden tank at the top. The jack ladder fed into a conventional log slide almost a kilometer long, a big wooden trough built on thick planks and supported on a trestle of heavy timbers. At the end of the slide, the water spilled out, and the second jack ladder grabbed the logs for the last leg of their uphill journey. To be accurate, there were really 8 jack ladders placed end to end, running 762 meters and climbing 27 meters to the crest of the Tramway Dam. It wasn't that the rest of David's planned 445-kilometer log drive was easy or inexpensive. Gilmour had to build other canals and dams and camps and roads. He also bought 6 new alligators, steam-powered tugs that could travel over land and water, and haul giant booms with 60,000 logs at a time. In fact, David spent another $200,000 to put everything in place to drive the Algonquin logs to Trenton. But $150,000 of that was spent on the tramway. Sitting in the auction room the day after spending $750,000 on timber limits, David would already have known that the company wouldn't survive long if he couldn't convert the Algonquin pine into lumber as quickly as possible. Whether out of confidence or desperation, Gilmour had his men in Algonquin cut enough pine to make 150,000 logs by the winter of 1893-1894. They were piled in huge dumps to await the spring thaw and begin the long drive to Trenton. At the time, the tramway hadn't been finished, let alone tested. Indicative of his determination, the first logs commenced their epic journey from the Algonquin highlands to Trenton just 18 months from the day of the auction. Lakes clear of ice. Ranger Steve Waters wrote in his diary on the 21st of April, 1894, "The Gilmour's drive commenced, the log dumps were released, and with a roar, the pine tumbled into the water. Long, slender skiffs called pointers darted about the seething mass. Men hopped from log to log with pike poles and peaveys. The steam alligators puffed and strained. Down the lakes, the booms of logs were winched, through the canal to the T, and on to the T Lake Dam. The dam quivered under a full head, and icy meltwaters poured through the sluiceway, like a smooth black tongue before breaking up into a foaming mass on the jagged rock ledges below.
But, the whole process, getting the logs from Algonquin Park to just down to here, wasn't a cinch, shall I say, because you had to come down the Oxtung River in Ragged Falls. And Ragged Fall, he built a log chute there because that's a big drop there, and he had to bring those logs down. I think he built more than that one, but I'm pretty sure he built that one just to get his logs into Lake of Bays. And then he had to tow them all the way down here with alligators, and the alligators wouldn't pull a setting hen off its nest, as far as power is concerned. They'd have to run the cables out, anchor it, and then winch in the alligator and pull a pod of logs behind it. And that was all the way from Dwight, which is, probably 8 miles by water. He put lights on his alligator so they could work at night because there's no wind, or the winds were down, so he didn't fight winds when he was traveling at night, and he could move better. And then he still had to get them over the hill down here. And that was, say, 90-foot lift, and it was quite a feat.
For many hectic days, the logs were fed through the sluice into the Oxtung. The swift current swept them downstream. Armies of drivers accompanied the churning mass, some riding pointers, others working from the shore or wading in the frigid water at the shoals, bends, and rapids, all striving to keep the lumber moving. At High and Ragged Falls, crews guided the logs into the big slides. The pace slowed briefly at Oxtung Lake. Here, the logs were gathered in booms again and manually winched 3 kilometers down to the outlet. Another dam controlled the flow down the Oxtung Rapids below. Along this treacherous 5-kilometer stretch, the drive crews had to be especially vigilant as the logs tumbled down the twisting, boulderous rapids and through narrow, rocky chutes. Smooth winding channels, interrupted only by the Sawmill Dam and low chute at Marsh's Falls near Dwight. They prevailed again for the remaining distance to Lake of Bays. Another alligator awaited the logs at the mouth of the Oxtung. With the timber gathered into booms behind it, the powerful craft winched itself slowly but steadily down the huge lake, then up the long eastern arm to Dorset, and the start of the tramway. In early May, the tramway was started up. The Campbellford Herald decried.
At 4 p.m., the electric bell was touched, the logs went over the tramway, and the Gilmour scheme was pronounced a grand success.
But he had to go down anyway, down through Rice Lake and everything else with them. So it took 2 years. 2 years to get from the bush to the mill. And the first year he had to stop in Bob Cage and he got frozen in. I would imagine he was frozen in all the way up. It was he had at one point about 600 people working for him in this part of the country. Not all of them here, but I think, I don't know this, but I assume that some of them were working in the bush. But beyond that, he had about 600 men.
Back in Trenton, they waited and waited. Winter came and went, and they waited some more. The logs from the first drive didn't reach Trenton until May and June of 1895. Undaunted, David believed he could make improvements. He ordered another cutting operation and another drive for 1895. He ordered the season's cut increased 50% to 30 million feet. 11 company logging camps operated on the Algonquin limits over the winter with an average of 55 men each. He hired 2 jobbers to cut even more. The mammoth task of supplying these operations required 65 teams of horses in constant service, and even then, a camp could be down to pork and bread before another team could reach them.
One of the major factors with the top end at the Raven Lake end, at the Gilmour Pond end, was we had 2 years in a row with very little rain in the summertime, dry summers, and he couldn't keep his pond up. And, so he had to shut down till he got enough power to lift the logs. And that was one of the things. Another factor was all his pulleys at that time were all done, or just rope pulleys. All the belts were rope belts. And, of course, they break and wear pretty too, and he was broken down a lot of times too with that. So there were a lot of factors that really hurt him: the lack of water, the breakdowns, and so on. It was quite there were a lot of things that hurt him in that deal, but the lack of water, I think, was a major part of it in the summertime.
And the waiting started again. David's optimism quickly turned to despair. David's 445-kilometer scheme proved to be technically possible, but it also proved to be nightmarishly expensive and slow. To make matters worse, much of the timber turned out to be over-mature and riddled with ring rot and other defects. The pine also bore scars from its long and hazardous journey. Lengthy immersion in water caused further deterioration in the wood. An operation like Gilmour's, saddled with high-cost timber and an expensive labor-intensive log drive, virtually demanded that most of the pine be of top quality if it was going to show any kind of profit. Meanwhile, the market for lumber was softening. Prices were going down. This time, it really was the beginning of the end for the Gilmours in Trenton. What David did next is what David always did. Believing the lesson to be learned from everything that had happened was that if it wasn't feasible to bring the logs to the sawmill, he was going to bring the sawmill to the logs.
He overrode a bit too. He needed it. He needed it for the mill. He needed that material. There wasn't much left, and he had that great big mill down there, and the whole community pretty well depended on him. And it was really a company town at that time, wasn't it, Trenton? He bounced right back from it. That was a mistake. Let's get going here, type of attitude. Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, Gilmour, when he moved up into the park to do and put his mill up in the park, it was just so he could use he put in a spur line to get into Booth's rail line so he could ship his lumber out of the park.
Salvaging what he could from Trenton and then investing another great deal of money, David decided to build a huge steam-powered sawmill at Canoe Lake, right in the middle of the Algonquin Highlands. To house his workers, he would create a village that would soon boast 700 inhabitants. It would even have its own hospital. It was the first and by far the largest such venture ever undertaken in Algonquin Park. The mill itself would be a 55 by 20 meter structure with 7 bandsaws and a crew of 700 to 800 men and a daily cutting capacity of 500,000 feet. Like the Trenton mill, it would have a galvanized iron roof. But this mill, and this was pure David, this mill would be built entirely from brick, not timber. In the middle of the forest, David built a mill out of brick. In April 1897, the Canoe Lake Mill cut its first log. By 1901, the Banks owned his Algonquin pine limits. The mill at Canoe Lake stood abandoned. and his famous tramway was slowly decaying in the bush near Dorset. Back in Trenton, where the mill had continued to saw logs cut in the old limits in Peterborough and Hastings, the door factory had usurped the mill as the company's main focus. In January 1904, the door factory was split off from Gilmour and Company as a separate firm, the Gilmour Door Company Limited. In June 1904, the rest of the operation at Trenton was listed for sale by tender. By 1909, the big mill at Trenton stood abandoned, waiting to be demolished. By that time, David Gilmour had moved to Buffalo, where he purchased another door factory. In Algonquin Park, the red brick walls of the Canoe Lake Mill stood for a few years after, but eventually they came down as well. Other buildings at the Canoe Lake site survived. The boarding house below Gilmour's hospital was turned into Mowat Lodge. It overlooked the barren shipyard of the old mill. A talented artist named Tom Thompson from Toronto made his base there while working and painting in the park. A favorite subject was the ghost ruins from the days of lumbering in the area. He had just left the lodge when he disappeared in July 1917. He was later found drowned in Canoe Lake. When the Trenton Mill was placed in the hands of a young David Gilmour, the mill was 25 years old and tired. Under David's direction, the Trenton Mill became a shining example of what a modern sawmill could be, complete with the most modern equipment money could buy, electric lights, and first-class fire protection. His log tramway demonstrated not only his genius, but also his determination to overcome any obstacle placed in his way. His box factory and sash and door factory were his methods of turning lumber into cash when the timber markets could not. His early use of electric power and the telephone confirms that he was always looking toward the future. But David no longer had a future in Trenton. As the banks foreclosed on his lumbering assets, he eventually left Trenton in 1905 with his family and never returned. David Gilmour died September 25, 1920, in Manhattan, New York, at 69 years. His wife Carolyn Gilmour and their children, Caroline, Isabel, David Jr., Marjorie, Alan, Helen, are all gone now. The sawmill operations had ceased to be profitable and were sold to Messrs. Gill and Fortune in 1905. The door factory in Trenton was kept open until 1910 and then remained closed until it was destroyed by a devastating fire on July 11, 1911. It was an empty shell of its former grandeur. In 1915, the British Chemical Company would build extensive works there. The big mill area was ill-used after it was torn down, going from open coal storage to refuse dump, then finally to Centennial Park. The town of Trenton survived, and the people moved on as they always had. Gilmour lumber is no more, just like the majestic old-growth pine that used to tower over the Bay of Quinte.
Come all you jolly fellas, come listen to my song. It's all about the lumber boys and how they get along. They're a crowd of jolly good fellas as ever you may find. It's how they spend their winter months in hurling down the pine. At 4 o'clock each morning, the bus begins to shout, "Heave out, my jolly teamsters, it's time to start the route." The teamsters, they will all jump up in a most fretful way. "Where is me boots, where is me pants, me socks has gone astray." At 6 o'clock it's breakfast and every man is out, for every man who is not sick will sure be on the route. There's sawyers and there's choppers to lay the timber low. There's swampers and there's loggers to drag it to and fro. in comes up the loader all at the break of day. Load up me slide 500 feet to the river, drive away. You can hear those axes ringing until the sun goes down. Hurrah, me boys, the day is spent to the shanty we are bound. Then snap and crack me whip flicks out, I whistle and I sing. I sit upon me double sled as happy as a king. My horse is always ready and answers to the gad. I'm sure there's no one happy as a double-sledded lad. And when we reached the shanty with cold hands and wet feet, we didn't pull off our larrigans, our supper for to eat. We sing and dance till 9 o'clock, then to our bunks we climb. Those winter months, they don't seem long in hurling down the pines. Springtime rolls around at last, and then the boss will say, heave down your saws and axes, boys, and help to clear away. And when the floating ice goes out, in business we will thrive. 200 able-bodied men are wanted on the drive.
And golden dreams, at last it seems have come true.